Great. It's really reassuring that so many people still awake at 10 o'clock to accompany us. I was saying to David, how comes they all have a drink and we don't? But it's also good to be sober when you're moderating as well. So I'm quite happy to stay sober. It's really fantastic to have a great lineup, to also be on the panel with Congresswoman Jane Harman. It's a real pleasure that you joined us as well. And also to have Tawalko with us, Carmen, as well, Chief Women Journalist Without Chains, Chairwoman as well. So it's really nice to have you. And also a Nobel Prize laureate, 2011. So fabulous. That's really great. So that's really fantastic. And then Emma Louise Powell, thank you very much for joining us, Shadow Minister for International Relations and Cooperation from South Africa as well. And I believe I heard you say you're a fellow Brit as well. Did I hear you say you were born in the UK as well?
I'm a dual citizen.
A dual citizen. Oh, nice. And then David Miliband, President CEO of International Rescue Committee and former Foreign Secretary for the UK.
Not a dual citizen.
Not a dual citizen, no. A North London boy like I am. Yeah, girl, I am. Look, this is a constant theme, and it's contemporary times. You know, literally nearly every summit that one goes to, and I don't even know when it started, but literally every summit you go to, there is a question mark, there is a debate about double standards, about hypocrisy, about the West versus the rest. And, you know, I attended actually last summer a really interesting conversation with Bellagio, and I don't know how many of you have seen this great document about standard deviation. And a few years ago, Munich did one called, they used a theme called Westlessness as well, which is quite a tongue twister, but also a spin on the same conversation, a sense that the West is losing ground, it's losing the values, the architect that it created around international law, the international rules-based order. I mean, in Davos, I heard that it was consigned to the museum. I didn't know which museum it was consigned to, but it was consigned to the museum, not the graveyard, but at least there for us to sort of memorialize and to hark back whenever we wanted to remind ourselves of the good old days as well. You know, and myself, Confedera International Crisis Group, have often written about sort of the double standards, the West versus the rest narrative as well. But I wondered whether we can sort of think about it in a different way. One of the things I was going to ask you was whether this conversation was now so passé, because we might be living in a slightly different age, a slightly an era sort of paradigm shift moment. And Jane is nodding her head. And for that reason, Jane, I'm going to turn to you first, because, you know, what is the problem? And if you are engaged in international relations and you're engaged in a business where states have interests, and yes, some of them will pool their sovereignty, but in the end, you have interests. And if you are engaged in international relations, there will oftentimes be inconsistencies, contradictions, competition, yes, moments of cooperation. But in the effort of also making sure that you're safeguarding the national interest of your country, isn't it inevitable at one point that you're going to run up against concerns that what you're doing appears inconsistent, contradictory, may look as though it's hypocritical, and yet in the end of the day, you are acting in the name of your national interest. So, Jane, I wanted to ask you, from American position, I mean, we often accuse the United States of double standards, and a lot of people can cite the differences in which it approached Gaza, Ukraine, and any other conflict we can mention. But let me ask you, how do you see the debate today on double standards?
Well, I'm glad I had a few glasses of wine, and it's late at night, and we're on the record, or are we on the record?
We yes, are on the record, because I understand everything at Munich, except for the fancy dinners, is on the record.
No, let me start with what I really believe, which is that our values are our strongest weapon. And I've said this forever. Stronger than tanks and guns. I have an amendment, which is the Ukrainian heart is Ukraine's strongest weapon. but it's the same idea. It is not just soft power, but it is, blinking red, telling the world what you care about most that is so strong. And I have felt for years that my country, I don't want to speak for anybody else's country, has been on what they call in law school a slippery slope. And I wrote a book about this, and it's called Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Solve Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. And I wrote this book I was around in the 1900s, but I wrote this book in 2021 as I was leaving the Wilson Center, where I wrote it, and it was about 30 years then since the end of the Cold War, and what we got right and what we got wrong, and what I got right and what I got wrong, because I was elected to Congress in 1992. And it's kind of a dismal list, because I got a few things right. I'm not that terrible. And I was a well-educated lawyer, but I got a lot of things wrong. And the things that I got wrong included some, as I looked, here's one. Okay, let's go that way. So it's 9/11. After 9/11, we were surprised. We should not have been surprised. I served on the National Commission on Terrorism. We predicted a major attack on U.S. soil. No one was listening. We were attacked. And then after that, we engaged in a series of activities that people who conducted them, I assume, acted in good faith to do them. But I, as the senior Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee at the time, try that, blessed some of these activities. Well, here was one thing that is directly on point. Mm-hmm. I went down to Guantanamo Bay Prison, which was set up without consulting the United States Congress. But I was on an early CODEL there. I went there 4 times. But the first time, there were chicken wire cages. The prisoners were in orange jumpsuits. We were not prepared to house these people. I have no idea how the Trump administration is housing the deportees it is now sending to Guantanamo, but that's what we were doing. On the way from the airport to the peninsula where the prison was, I asked the 3-star what laws, explain to me the legal framework around this prison. And he said, without blinking, it is here. Or why is this prison here? And he said, to be beyond the reach of U.S. law. Mm. Now, for those of you who know this, the U.S. has rented Guantanamo, the Guantanamo area for years from the Cubans. And there's this kind of silly thing where we send our check and they put it in a desk, and it's for $35 or whatever. But anyway, this 3-star said, to be beyond the reach of U.S. law. Now, I might not be the smartest legal beagle. I am not. But I did attend Harvard Law School, and I knew that couldn't be true. And what did I do? Nothing. I said nothing, because I thought maybe there's some argument that I missed, and, maybe I don't understand it, and I don't want to embarrass this fellow, but also there must be some national security justification for this. So over time, as some of you may know, our Supreme Court held that Guantanamo Bay is within U.S. jurisdiction, and the people we housed there, we still have 30 people there who have not been charged with crimes. I'm not saying they're not, high-value targets, and we are justified removing them from society, but they haven't been charged with crimes, and because in well-understood terms, they were tortured, they cannot be tried and convicted in a court of law in the United States. So there they are, and in this legal limbo. And that's just one example of things that my country did following 9/11 that tarnish my view and faith in the fact that our values are our strongest weapon. And there have been others, but I think others want to answer this too. I would just say the rule of law is to me, and still is to me, and I hope to many of you, the cornerstone of a free democracy. And it is the way that people have a chance to right wrongs and to live in freedom. And if we don't have that, I'm not sure what we do have. And so there has been a double standard in the United States, and promises made or not promises kept. Just one other example that everyone will agree with, the way we left Afghanistan and the promises we made to the people there and what is still happening to some of those people. So I'm not moving to some other country, but I want my country to be better. And I think if and when it is better, not only will some people finally get the justice they deserve, but it will also be what it should be, which is the country with the longest written constitution in history and the shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan described it as. And I want that back.
Jane, I have a couple of questions I wanted to follow you up on, but I'll come back, and I know there will be others in the audience because there are a number of things that are happening today, but also under previous administrations that I think a number of us would want to discuss with you. But let me turn to Tawakkol and bring it closer to the Middle East as well, and get your sense, sort of your general sense of sort of double standards, not just the. It's very easy to talk about the Western double standards against the Middle East, and you should talk about that, absolutely. But I'd also be interested to understand how that debate plays out between the countries of the Middle East vis-a-vis each other as well.
Okay. I think if we talk about double standard in the Middle East, it will be a very soft word. It's more than that. It's hypocrisy. What is happening now in Middle and before, not just the Middle East, is really, really suffer from the hypocrisy of the Western governments. And I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about NGOs. I'm talking about.
I think we're having a slight problem with your microphone. So let's get you to yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah.
Again, so I said that. If we use double standard in describing the policy of West toward Middle East, it will be a very soft word. It's more than that. Yeah. It is a hypocrisy, really, really. Unfortunately, and it is not just because of Trump administration. This is the policy of the administrations, of the governments in the Western countries, and especially in the U.S. And of course, I blame Trump for making more, he is so aggressive toward, the policy in our countries, but it's more than that. The Democratic Party, the political party, regardless, who is the president. Unfortunately, you see that when they give up their claimed values, right? Congresswoman, she said, that our strong weapon is the value, and I totally agree on that. And this is in all my speeches. I always say, remind the West, you have to keep in your values and principles. And at the time that you lose it, you lose your power. Western governments and countries become weak because they give up, their values and principles. First, when they make allies with the dictators. And this is a very, very big definition of double standard. They said we are with freedom, we are with democracy, but at the reality, they are really, really support the dictators in the region and in Latin America, in Africa, etc. So they support the dictators, and they thought that the dictators, they really reserve their interests, but the reality, no. The dictators is number one, is the dangerous for their interests and also for the international security, and we can explain that if we have time. And number two is with their policy and in supporting occupation. What happened in Gaza until today? Unfortunately, most of the Western governments didn't have a very clear position about what is happening in Gaza. the only thing that they are doing in the Middle East is just to protect Israel, not to protect humanity there, not to protect peace there, not to protect security. So they don't have a very clear vision how to protect, how to protect the global peace. They think with protecting Israel that they will lead, to the peace. Or no, the result, because of the occupation and because of the continuous attack on Palestine, is the October 7th. Let me finish. Is the October 7th and the attack, and I against it. But at the same time, why it happened? They protect the Israel.
Sorry.
No.
And there will have. Sorry.
And let me finish.
You'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. You'll have a right to reply. Please carry on. Yeah.
And also the 40,000 people, women, 23rd of them, they are women and girls, and nobody. And no clear position against what's happening in Gaza. So this is just two examples. And what's happening in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq. So they said that we came for democracy, we came for freedom, while they came to collapse countries. Mm-hmm. They withdraw from Afghanistan and they hand over Afghanistan to Taliban. And they occupy Iraq, and they made Iraq under chaos. So we suffer. We suffer from Western policies, and I think it's the time for Western governments to wake up. And I think they started to wake up after Putin invasion to the Ukraine. They started, oh my God, what did we do? And what did they do with Syria before, when they didn't make any action to help people in Syria? And the last thing was double standard. They said that they are against Bashar al-Assad, and they make sanction against him. And now people in Syria had their freedom, and now there is no real situation and position that support Syrian people. Now Syrian people, Syrian freedom with the lifting sanctions. So we need really from Western governments to wake up. And I think this is a very important solution for them. Yeah. Because of their policies, people like Trump came to the power.
Western governments don't need my defense. But I think there's a little bit of nuance in some of the things that you said, at least on Syria. But also, I think also understanding some of the positions that Western governments have taken vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine as well. I think it's important to acknowledge that. David, before I come into you, Emma, let me ask you, because you come from a country that really has been at the forefront of the accountability debate when we want to understand international accountability, transitional justice, generations of issues around reparations, memorialization, international truth and justice, and sort of the foundations of some of the things that we've been looking at. South Africa has been at the forefront. Can you explain that trajectory in terms of how it plays out on the continent? Because it's very quick for us to again slam the West for double standards, but sometimes I think we should also bring it home as well. So South Africa has certainly been vocal on Ukraine and Gaza, but on some conflicts closer to home, we may wonder just how far South Africa has been also sort of attentive to things that I think where questions of accountability should be addressed also consistently.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It's indeed a valid question, and I think that it's a question that is not asked often enough in global forums because, of course, despite Africa being the continent of the future, we are often disregarded and our voices are not adequately represented in global multilateral institutions. And, of course, the African Union has taken some fairly decisive steps towards action in that regard with the Isilwini consensus back in, I believe it was, 2005, where the AU determined that Africa would work towards achieving 2 permanent seats at the United Nations Security Council and 5 rotating non-permanent seats. And 20 years later, we are no closer towards achieving representation for the continent of the future, and that is something that I believe that the West and the global North in particular need to join our calls in terms of resolving.
But although, just to qualify, I mean, one of the things that President Biden, or at least Linda Greenfield-Thomas, called for before she left the administration was the idea that Africa should get 2 seats on at the Security Council, assuming we can even get to a serious conversation about a reform of the Security Council. What about that debate?
Absolutely. And I mean, that also goes to a broader debate around veto powers in terms of the current global deadlock with the access of malign actors and the destabilization and the way in which the United Nations Security Council is essentially checkmated because of the role of the veto. So those are broader arguments, but your question specifically relates to South Africa's role in the region, and then in the context of the actions that my nation, our nation, has taken towards advancing justice or leveraging international multilateral institutions in order to make a determination on certain accusations that have been made by our government. But we fail sometimes to apply the same level of accountability in our own backyard. So, for example, if we look to the Southern African Development Community, nations like Zimbabwe and Mozambique, we see time after time the SADC rubber stamping rigged elections. Now, for example, with the crisis in the DRC, we have sadly lost 14 of our soldiers in the last 2 weeks. We had a debate of national importance in the South African Parliament on Monday. And what some of our foreign ministers' speech included was that we were relying on Mnangagwa, the president of Zimbabwe, to lead the SADC's charge in terms of the joint East African Community SADC negotiations. Now, everybody who's watching the situation closely knows that the European Union's report on the outcome of that election stated there was serious irregularities. The SADC's own observer mission report was just filed away. If we look at Mozambique, the violence that's broken out with Frelimo having claimed early victory, and it's destabilized our borders. We've had to shut our borders on a number of occasions because of the violence spilling over. There has been a consistent lack of accountability by our leaders in the region. So whilst it's all well and good for our foreign ministry to initiate court action in the International Court of Justice in regards to the crisis in the Middle East, we have got far more severe crises, for example, Sudan, where it was the failure of our government to have arrested al-Bashir back in 2017 that led to the rapid expansion of the Janjaweed and the slaughter of over, I believe, 200,000 civilians in Sudan. In the DRC, we're kicking for touch every time on negotiations being led by leaders who lack political credibility. So I think that whilst we absolutely echo, and we would like everybody in this audience and everybody in the global north who is watching to join in our calls and advocating for a greater representation of the African continent in global multilateral forums and institutions, we ourselves do need to take a long, hard look in the mirror in terms of practicing what we preach in our own backyard.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. I'm sure people in the audience would want to ask you questions. David, I'm going to ask you not to put your IRC hat on, but just sort of put your hat of when you were back in government, and imagine if you were in government today. I think one happy days. But I mean, one of the big challenges. I mean, one of the things that you've championed is this idea of the access of impunity. And the real sort of human suffering that you're seeing. But in a context where there's increasing fragmentation between oftentimes allies as well, in trying to work out sort of how you deploy multilateralism in a consistent way. How do you manage that very difficult national sort of interest versus the desire to try to preserve international norms if those norms sort of clash with your own sort of national security agenda as well? What does it really look like from a government perspective, especially in today's very challenged world? Because I think it's also important to bring it down to the realities of governing as well in a very turbulent time.
Let me say two things.
Yeah.
The first of which is to pick up what the Shadow Minister, Emma, has just talked about. She used the phrase, practice what you preach.
Yeah.
And let's just start by recognizing that a double standard exists if you say one thing and do another. That's what we're talking about. And it's interesting that the first part of this conversation should only have been about Western countries who do one thing or say one thing and do another. Every country in the world has signed the UN Charter. The Russian Federation is a signatory to the UN Charter, which includes commitments to the territorial integrity of all the nations of the world. And it's a double standard to invade your neighbor when you're a signatory of the UN Charter. So the first thing I just want to ground ourselves in is that what was remarkable about the post-Second World War settlement, in learning the lessons not just of the previous 20 years, but really going back further, probably to 1815 or even earlier, it joined countries together, capitalist and communist, dictatorships and democracies, to sign up to a set of commitments that didn't just uphold or commit to uphold the rights of states, but for the first time in human history, committed to the rights of individuals, to people, as well as the rights of states. And it's therefore the debate about double standards should be about every country and whether or not it's living up to the commitments it made in the UN Charter. My own view is we don't need a new UN Charter. We need to live up to the UN Charter that we've got, uphold the UN Charter that we've got. So the first point is that the searchlight of double standards should go everywhere, not just on one side. Secondly, I think that the dilemmas that are posed for governments have two dimensions. One involves, Jane Harman referred to, which is what you do essentially on your own internal affairs, because after 9/11, the US commitments to its own citizens were stretched to the limit. But it also, there's the second set of commitments is how does one treat foreign policy and one's allies? And one should be held to account for both, both for the domestic and for the international. Now, there are obvious challenges when your own security is under threat. There are obvious challenges when your allies see their security under threat. I think that it's not just a government question, it's a national question as to how to uphold the standards to which we believe we're committed. And my own view is that the debate of the moment, and this is why I don't quite uphold the axis of impunity, that might give a wrong impression. My view is that the debate of this decade is not about democracy versus autocracy. The debate of this decade is about accountability versus impunity. And I think the way in which governments are held to account domestically is very importantly related to the way in which they hold themselves accountable for their actions internationally. I think they're connected. Well, just to finish the point, it's very interesting if you go back to the debates of the post-1945 period, the arguments for the international rule of law were not about spreading democracy around the world. They were about having a rules-based international order that strengthened those countries that were democracies at home. It was a bulwark to democracy at home. And I think it should be very striking to people that we're at a time when the international rule of law is in retreat, but also democratic norms at home are in retreat, and the two are related.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you. I mean, without necessarily wanting to be hysterical about it, but there's a sense in which the state capture that you're seeing in some places, and it's up to you to put a label on what countries those are, but the state capture you're seeing in some places are are being extended to international fora. So, countries, populists, parties, whatever, however you want to describe them. And I agree with you that I don't want to label democracy versus autocracy. Even democratic countries can capture their institutions and misuse them. And extending that internationally, how do you begin to preserve, or how do you begin to reverse the trend that you're seeing playing out domestically if you're going to be able to protect the institutions internationally? Because it's very hard to do one without the other. So if you're going to preserve international norms, how do you begin to do it at home and in a way that makes sense to societies at home who also have a different set of agendas and maybe don't necessarily see or are not necessarily concerned about double standards, hypocrisy, or anything like that? Jane, I see you've got your mic. I'll give you the floor, but David, come back to you.
I think David's accountability versus impunity is a very good frame, because I always thought the democracy versus autocracy frame made very little sense, because most states would claim they're democracies when they're not, and sadly, my own country has increasing autocratic tendencies and certainly claims it's democracy. But I wanted to make a broader point to your point, which is I think all of our institutions are in decline, internationally and domestically. I don't see countries defending fiercely their institutions right now. I also don't see much accountability for those who don't defend them. I think maybe it's social media, maybe it's what we ate for breakfast, but there is extremely little conversation around norms at all. And so I think, using David's words, I think impunity is raging in the land, and that is extremely scary in every country, certainly including my own. And how do we get back to first of all some common view of a world with order? Let's leave out other words. A world in some order. I'm not sure I know how to do that, and I don't think it's prized politically. And I think the noisiest voices are the people who get elected these days in both. I mean, I'm talking about the U.S., but making a lot of noise and being performative is a huge plus politically in America. Being bipartisan is a huge minus.
Sorry, you wanted to respond, yeah? And then I'm going to come to the audience to ask some questions.
I think we are really at real danger around the world, because as both said that, now the democracy itself, it collapsed everywhere, and especially in these very big, well-democratic countries. So what we want, what we should do now, we shouldn't lose hope. Because those, now the institutions is, destroyed. And now what is happening in America, it's really give this courage to dictators, to the disbelievers in the institutions, to be strong and to be unified. So, no, we shouldn't give up. All of us. Now, when I said before that Western governments should wake up, they have Democrats should wake up and should unite.
But let me bring it closer to your region. What does it look like in the Middle East, for example, to begin to think about sort of, for lack of a better choice of words, what do the norms, the principles, the values look like within the Middle East region by Middle Eastern countries?
There is principles and values of freedom, democracy, justice, and rule of law. And because of that, people make revolutions against dictators. And because of that, people still make revolutions against dictators and face counter-revolution. And what is happening in the Middle East now, it's not because we didn't believe or we gave up on the principles that we fought for, or our calls for accountability against our dictators, and also against the international dictators who backed them, like Iran, like Saudi and Emirates, and like countries that also backed them. So we didn't give up, and we continue our struggle for that. So what is the important thing that we should be unified? It's very important that we should protect this international institutions, like the International Criminal Court, now which is under a very great attack from the strongest country in the world. The Secretary General now, under attack and also under accountability from the U.S. And at the same time, this kind reforms of the international, institutions like Security Council. The Security Council is one of the reasons that make people around the world doesn't believe on the institutions. In Middle East, if you return to the Middle East, we fought for democracy, for justice, for accountability in the local field and also in international field. Without accountability, our dictators, will feel free.
Let me turn to the audience because I know a number of people want to ask questions, please. And I'll ask you to please ask questions. I mean, we're all entitled to our views, but I'd ask that you put it in the realm of respectability.
Try my best.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to speak a bit about hypocrisy.
Yeah.
There were, before 1948, more than 700,000 Jews around the Middle East. Now there are none. Okay? So talk about ethnic cleansing. By the way, first slaughter against Jews, Hebron, 1929. There was no occupation. There were 800 Jews in Hebron. Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a Nazi who hated Jews, had a blood libel that they want to take over Al-Aqsa, and the community that was there for centuries was gone. So I want to stress about hypocrisy and hypocrisy in the Middle East, and I think Comfort asked about this, and she didn't get an answer. There's an occupation of northern Syria by Turkey. There is an oppressed people called the Kurdish people in the Middle East that nobody addresses. There's a conflict in Sudan that is being supported by sides in the Middle East and countries, and nobody addresses it. So let's be real and let's say that everybody is hypocritical, and it's not just the West. So I really want to get this opinion on this.
Thank you for answering some of the questions I asked. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question, make an observation, raise a query, or ask specific questions to our panelists. I still have some questions to ask them, but I want to capture the view of the room before I carry on. Nobody wants to talk about double. David, let me ask you a question, because nobody's rising to the challenge of the evening as well. David, we talk about these issues, but let me break it down, and now I'll ask you to put your IRC hat on, as a, premier, pivotal humanitarian agency. And I think one of the things that has really been quite stark when you put it in practical terms is just the sheer scale of human suffering and the sense in which one particular group of people's lives are valued over the other as well. How do you deal with that dilemma in your organization? How do you keep the morale up amongst your colleagues when they sense that sometimes the humanitarian agencies themselves are being weaponized, when it's also seeing a sense in which the way resources are dispersed among various conflicts? So more aid poured into one particular conflict versus another conflict. The entire international architecture being focused on one particular conflict as opposed to another one. How do you cope with that in your day-to-day activity as a humanitarian actor?
I think, first of all, it's worth saying that we're an organisation that works in 35 to 40 countries that are either in conflict or sheltering people from conflict. We have a responsibility to push against the tendency of the headlines to go from one place to another and ignore other places. I'm very glad that Emma mentioned Sudan. It's the world's largest humanitarian crisis. It's the #1 on our emergency watch list. It has 26 million people in humanitarian need. It has 11 million internally displaced. It has 2 million refugees in neighbouring states, Chad, South Sudan, poor states, not rich states. So #1, I think we have to push against the tendency for the headlines to ignore important parts of the world. The second thing that's very important, I think, is that we bear witness to what is going on. That can be very difficult raises very difficult dilemmas because sometimes bearing witness to what's going on brings risk to one's own aid workers, so it has to be done in a very sensitive and difficult way. I think that's important. Thirdly, I think it's very important that to the extent that one has flexible money of one's own, and we're a large NGO, but most of the money we get, 3/4 of the $1.5 billion we get, is from governments who are deciding that they want to target this conflict or another conflict. But to the extent that we have our own money, unrestricted, we've got to push against the tendency to inequality of treatment and support and push towards greater attendance to the greatest needs. Now, the truth is that humanitarian needs have gone from 80 million people in humanitarian need 8 years ago to 305 million people in humanitarian need today. But there's one constant. 8 years ago, there were 20 countries that accounted for more than 80% of humanitarian need, and it remains 20 countries that are responsible for more than 80% of humanitarian need today. They're different countries, some are the same, but about 8 of the 20 are different. But there's still an enormous concentration of the most extreme disadvantage. And that changing focus of extreme poverty towards conflict and fragile states, I think, poses massive challenges to the whole aid system. Because I think the fourth and final thing I'd say about our responsibility, we have to speak to where aid will make most difference.
Right.
And the truth is that today, remittances are more than 3 times greater, the level of aid flows into Southern Africa. But the aid system is still 3/4 not going to the fragile and conflict states that reflect more than half of the world's extreme poor. And so that reorientation of the aid system is especially important. So that, I just want to say that. Can I just say one other thing in relation to the previous discussion? I think that the start of a real engagement with issues of impunity and accountability starts with measuring it. And I chair the advisory board of an organization called the Atlas of Impunity. And it's published every year at the time of the Munich Security Conference. So tomorrow...
Actually, so it's not the axis of impunity, it's the Atlas of impunity.
Well, I champion the Atlas of Impunity, but the Atlas of Impunity maps an axis of impunity in some ways. But tomorrow there is the launch by the authors of the 2024, so it looks back over the last year, the Atlas of Impunity. And it looks at impunity in 5 dimensions. It's conflict, there's governance, there's human rights, there's environmental degradation, which is a form of impunity that very rarely gets talked about. And there's economic exploitation, which is also a form of impunity. And the Atlas ranks every country in the world for its level of impunity. It's just one factoid to come out of it. The top-ranked country for impunity this year is Syria. And it's interesting that Syria should have, since the data was collected, it should have been subject to a extraordinary revolution, really. Now, we don't know what the revolution holds. There's a very wide spectrum of scenarios for what will happen. But I think that the contribution of the Atlas is to arm those who want to understand and argue about impunity and accountability with the data to at least give some life to what's going on for residents of different countries in different parts of the world.
Could I just, well, first of all, suggest something we can all agree on rather than disagree, and that is that the drastic cuts to development and humanitarian aid are boneheaded and cruel and not only destabilizing many good organizations, but hurting both workers and those intended to be helped. And it's dreadful at a time like this with all of the challenges in the world. So I think, does anyone disagree with that? No.
I don't think anybody
I don't
dares.
think anyone does.
You disagree, please?
No, I think that giving aid should be thoroughly examined.
Okay.
It makes the country dependent on it instead of working to develop its own resources and using private sector.
A good point. And
to really grow. And
all right.
A lot of countries are just getting used to this aid, and they don't grow because of it.
Well, I think I think the facts are different on the ground in different places, and a lot of countries are learning how to care for their own citizens. But that wasn't the point I was going to make. I'm on the board of Freedom House, which, like other organizations, is severely challenged now because so much of its money came from government sources. There is private sector sources, and it produces something called Freedom in the World, which is a kind of bookend to what David is talking about, the Atlas of Impunity. And I do think we need metrics. That was my other point that I wanted to make, that I thought maybe we could agree on, which show whether these various places work, how they work, and who's helped. And it is important not to spend money, and this is my one comment that I will make about the DOGE effort in the United States. I think we should be spending money efficiently. I do think we should be spending money efficiently, but I also do think that the human safety net, soft power, and our development efforts are exactly what we should be spending money on.
I was going to actually ask, how do you use these matrix as well in terms of trying to shape and shift policy? But Emma, you've got a question that you have. And did you have your hand up as well? No, okay.
I just wanted to comment on the extent of the aid cuts in terms of what their implications are. They're very real life implications. In South Africa, we had just over 2 decades ago the highest HIV AIDS rate per capita in the world in the little town that I'm from in KwaZulu-Natal. And we have calculated that we know that 17% of our national health response budget comes directly from PEPFAR. Cutting that budget with 24 hours notice does not leave our Treasury with enough time to plan to plug those gaps. It is cruel, it is inhumane, and it is potentially going to lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And it is this level of impunity and irrationality that the post-Second World War rules-based international order, the development of the Bretton Woods institutions, the promulgation of the United Nations Charter, the agreements that we all, as freedom-loving democracies, entered into, that would compel accountability on the part of states. But now we are seeing, because those of us who are invested at an intrinsic level in the continuity of liberal democracy, we have not been smart enough, we have not made our ideas attractive enough, and young people who have played by the rules, who've gone to university, who've got jobs, who can't afford to buy houses, are now turning to social media, where we've got these tech oligarchs that are sort of, you could say, new government SARS, and they are using their empires to drive populist sentiment that young people who are disillusioned with what we all consider to be sacred, which is liberal democracy, they are rejecting these ideas because it hasn't delivered dividends. And the consequences are that in the spaces in the world that we're trying to play by the rules, we're trying to advance democracy, we're trying to, in South Africa, for example, we've just had our second miracle transition in 30 years. You know, a peaceful transfer of power at the tip of the African continent. We're playing by the rules. And yet we are the ones who suffer for the impunity of those on the global stage that can dictate at whim and perpetuate populist ideas that are ultimately going to be bad for all of us. And we've got to get smarter. Each one of us in this room, each one of us invested in liberal democracy, we've got to get smarter about how we translate our beliefs into tangible ideas that we can sell to young people who are voting.
So I imagine I'm going to ask what's on everybody's mind from a South African perspective. From where you sit, what does that look like? What does getting smarter look like? How do you be? And the other question, Emma, is that your country later this year will host the G20 as well. The African Union was added on to become a member of the of the G20. So how does South Africa get smarter, and how do we begin to translate that up to the pivotal multilateral body of the continent to start thinking about getting smarter on these issues?
So I think we've got to get clear that whether we like it or not, we're seeing a rise of transactionalism. So we're moving into an era because when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. We are now entering into this very transactional era. So we've got to work with what we've got, and we've got to leverage our respective strengths and weaknesses as well. But I think, and it's something that I'm deeply passionate about, being a politician, navigating the social media space, understanding that in the context of the new Cold War, where Africa once again is a fertile proxy territory for these hybrid battles to play out, we've got to start getting very focused in terms of how we deal with cyber threats, cyber warfare, and dealing with dis and misinformation. I think that's something that we need to start having conversations about, because we've seen in places like Mali and Burkina Faso and in the Sahel region how you can take a TikTok video of a protest that happened 6 years ago in another part of the world, and you can make it go viral, and you can foment mass violence in areas across Africa. We've seen it happen actually all over the world. No, there hasn't been an election that it hasn't happened in recently. So we've got to get clear on navigating cyber threats, and we've got to get clear in terms of how we continue to advance and advocate for a rules-based international order, but in the new context of this more sort of transactionalist.
I'm curious to see how you do that in this sort of new unknown. We don't know where we're headed to. Certainly, we're in a paradigm shift. But I see a gentleman at the back there wants to ask a question as well.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Comfort and everyone. Talking about double standards, I'm from Syria. I'm from the Syrian delegation. And being in the opposition side for 14 years and then now in the official side, I think I can comment and I can contribute to the double standard to support Mr. Tawakkal's point. Okay, so we didn't really craft our theory so far, but being in the Syrian crisis for the last 14 years, and as I said, moving from the opposition side now to the actual state side, I think it's not about standards. It's about geopolitics, about power, about, as you know, this the theme of this conference is it bipolar, is it multipolar, is it non-polar? So I think the change of the powers in the world, changing of the geopolitics in the world will change really the standard, will change how the state will act in different aspects. We can't depend on values for different and a lot of reasons. It's politics, it's states. Every state will go for its own interest. But also we should put a lot of effort and a lot of percentage on the values. This is true, but also we should read the picture in the full picture. We are now crafting our theory in Syria. We were the victims of double standards, but we are willing to forgive and forget if those people who did the double standard stand up with us without mentioning name. I'm being generic, isn't it, Mrs. Comfort? This is good. Thank you so much for everyone.
No, thank you. I mean, look, that's quite an important point as well, because in there is the idea of reconciliation as well, which is what you're sort of advocating for as well. But if we are beginning to shape this idea of a sort of a new norms, that there's an element of reconciliation. To hear it from you, thank you for saying that as well.
There's
James,
also something I would like to add. Well, first of all, good luck to you, and you're trying to build a pluralist government, and we should commend you for that. But after the Arab Spring, a lesson from that was, first of all, it wasn't a spring; it was an Arab upheaval. But a lesson that at least I learned from that was that it's much easier to tear down governments than build up new governments. And the other part of that lesson was that young people who take Egypt, for example, who were very instrumental in tearing down the existing government, weren't interested themselves in participating in a new government. And a key to fixing this, and a key to accountability, and a key to doing what I think everyone in this room wants to do, which is to create a new, possibly different and possibly multipolar, let's use that term, rules-based order, is for young people to want the better world that sadly my generation has not left you. My apologies to all of you over here. I didn't get it right. I tried, but I didn't get it right. And I think you have to invest. Everyone here has skin in the game, has worked hard to try to make things better. Whether we've succeeded or not, whether we understand it perfectly or not, of course we don't. And many of you have tried. But if you opt out and just say this is terrible, and it's tempting sometimes,
well, Jane,
it'll never get better.
There's 6 minutes left, and I want to put a challenge down to all of you as panelists, because I don't want people to have nightmares when they leave the room. The challenge, I think, in this next 6 minutes is to try to answer the question that you posed, Jane, but also Emma. You tried to get us to agree on something as well. What of this current state that we're in can we agree upon that we can take into the next phase? Is there anything that you think can be held on to as well? Let me start with you. I'm starting with you, Tamaka. You can answer what Jane asked us twice. Can we agree on something? She didn't quite answer she didn't say what the something is.
Of course.
But what can we agree on that we think we can take with us, or is worth fighting for, to preserve, to take with us as we try to shape what the next order looks like?
The next order looks like the world order that save freedom, justice, equality, and rule of law. And we shouldn't give up this dream, because everything is everywhere is collapsing, and I think we can work together for that. If we lose the belief in the future, what will we do? We will cry every day and give up to those extremists, to the world war, the leader of wars. No, we shouldn't do that. And regarding about Arab Spring, people, and I was one of them, and I'm still one of them, people, when they go to the street and make a revolution against dictators, they knew that they will build countries that build on democracy, accountability, and rule of law. And they didn't go for nothing. They went to the streets peacefully from the beginning, and then some of the countries like Syria, like Libya, forced to hold arms in front of the violence, but they didn't give up their dreams and sacrifice, and didn't give up their sacrifices. So if we return back to the Arab Spring movement, people didn't regret and continued it. So the problem, and here I want to talk about Yemen, my country, and about Sudan, which is very important. My country, Yemen, we made a revolution against the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. All people of Yemeni people went to the street against him and won the battle against him. And then Iran supported Houthi militia to make the coup in Yemen. But unfortunately, the story is very big. But unfortunately, Iran, from one hand, and Saudi and Arabia from other hand, which is they are in the proxy war, decided to be against.
We can't tell this story now with two minutes.
Because of what she said about where is Yemen? Yemen is in the scene. Yeah. Sudan in the scene. Yeah. But people are fighting for their freedom, for their justice, and for democracy and for rule of law.
Emma, let me ask you.
2 sentences. I think we've got to acknowledge at the highest possible level that isolationism leads to reduced collective action, which is not in any of our long-term interests, 1. And 2, I speak to the young people in this room because you are the future of this world, and we together will map what this world looks like. It's looking fairly dystopian at present. And I just want to appeal to everybody in this room that we work harder to sell our ideas and make other young people understand why liberal democracy matters. That way, we counter fascism and populism.
Thank you. David?
I want to take a lesson from our delegate from Syria, and it's a simple lesson. Cruelty and hard power don't always win. And for many years, you heard people at this conference say that the civil war was over and that Assad had won. And actually, that wasn't true, because in the hearts of people who were even in the Syrian army, never mind people who were in Idlib or in the northeast of Syria, cruelty wasn't winning. And so it's a time when there's a lot of hard power being used in a way that seems to be dispositive, but actually cruelty isn't a very effective recruiting strategy. And the human spirit is pretty strong in the more extreme circumstances. It's under duress in the relatively more privileged parts of the world.
Jane?
I think I've spoken too much, so
you posed a question, and I wanted to tease it out.
Can I do something very unfair?
Do that.
And turn it back on you?
Turn back on me, yeah. Look, I want to pick up because you said something interesting. I come from a country that has gone through a civil war, and where the assertions of civil war were proclaimed on the country. So those are two countries as well. And I've seen what it means. I've seen what it means to destroy a country. I've seen the price that your parents pay, and that they can't return home as well. So I think the idea of how people live together shapes how then you perform internationally as well. If you can't reconcile your people at home, if you can't address the grievances at home, that makes it very difficult to start to build a very more viable international norms and architecture, because those shapes the principles that carry us overseas as well. So I worry about the fabric of society, because it's shaping how the international norms and principles are going to hold into the future. It matters. And we always say it always starts at home. And if you start undermining home front and institutions that create and preserve family, I don't see how you can then begin to shape what happens internationally.
So very sadly, my country, which led or co-led the foundation on which we have all grown up, the rules-based international order, is in disarray at home, and with huge factions fighting each other in total disagreement. And so, building on what you just said, we are not in a good position to lead for the future, and I think that is extremely tragic, because who will fill the void? It won't be some other liberal democracy.
I have to say you're not alone, sadly. There are numbers who are also in this, you said it yourself, David, duress. A number of societies in duress. Thank you all to everybody who listened to us mostly talking. Thank you for all of you for cheering us on, but also for our great panellists for holding out for an hour of tough questions. Thank you very much.
Good job.